Good morning, good morning, good morning. Thank you so much for joining me for Daily Spark with Dr. Angela. I'm your host, Dr. Angela Chester. Well, you know what we like to do here on Daily Spark, and that is enlighten, inspire, and empower you to become your best self. Scripture reminds us that the tongue is a small thing that makes grand speeches, but a tiny spark can set a great forest on fire. And today I have an author who is going to ignite your mind about marriage, divorce, and the law. So let me tell you a little bit more about my guest today, Solon Phillips. He is out of the Bowie, Maryland area, and he is also a JD and an MBA. As a socio-religious analyst and award-winning author whose work has been included in legal treaties and legal law articles, he writes, speaks, and teaches extensively on socio-religious and legal issues, focusing his attention on relationships and family matters, which also includes dating, marriage, and divorce. He also enjoys storytelling and is an accomplished playwright whose works have been featured in the DC Metro Theater Arts. Solon is the proud father of two, and he enjoys being out and about, so including running, weightlifting, bird watching, and spending time in the great outdoors. So that's right, folks. We're talking about the book Colored Water, Marriage, Involuntary Divorce, the Law, and God. So without further ado, let's go on and bring Solon in the room. Hello, Solon. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello, how are you?
Thanks so much for spending some time with us today. You have so much to talk about, and for those of you who can visit on the website, and we'll definitely give that out in a second, you will see that the book is really packed with so much information, so I definitely plan on picking your brain. So there's something that intrigued me, and that is the phrase that you use, involuntary divorce. Can you let us know what is that, or what do you mean by that?
Involuntary divorce basically is a divorce that happens to someone who doesn't necessarily want the divorce. Usually when there's a divorce, one person is the one who really wants it, and the other person is either made to accept it or they fight against it, and they just really don't want it. So the term involuntary divorce, it's a divorce that's not wanted.
And I'm sure that unfortunately there are many people who kind of fall into that category. Now, in your book, there's a chapter about whether marriage is a contract or a covenant. And for many people, they have an understanding, according to what their church believes, marriage to be as well. What do you explain it as, or what's your perspective from this in your book?
Right. So in the Christian sect, Christians, a lot of times they like to say that marriage is a covenant, something that's very solemn, and it's bigger than a contract. And people who are not so much in the church, people, I don't want to say atheists, but people who are just not so much into the Christian faith, they may classify marriage as a contract. It's an agreement between two people. So in this particular chapter, I dissect the terms of a contract and a covenant, biblically speaking. So a contract, rightfully so, is an agreement between two or more people, and they both agree to do certain things. So when you look at marriage, it looks very much like a contract. But legally, in order for something to be a contract, you have to have grounds to enforce the contract. In other words, you have to make something, there has to be a remedy for a breach of the contract. So if I contract to paint your house and I stop midway, you could sue me to pay someone else to finish the house, right? Because I promised to you I was going to do it, and I never did. So you just pay someone else, and then you could sue me for the damages, which were you have to spend more money to get it done. That would be a contract. If there's no provision for a breach, then it's not a contract. It's just a promise, an unenforceable promise. So based on that, when you look at marriage, there's no provision for a breach. If we get married and I say, hey, I don't like you anymore, I don't want to be married, there's nothing that you can do to enforce that. So legally, marriage can't be a contract. So when you look at the term covenant, and biblically, covenants they always involved God, right? And throughout the Bible, when we read about covenants, God was always there, and God makes unconditional promises. So if you want marriage to be a covenant, you can't have conditions. You can't have a grounds for an actual divorce, because that's contrary to the nature of God. So that chapter concludes with saying that marriage is neither a contract it's neither a contract or a covenant. If you want it to be either or, you have to change the terms of it. You either have to take divorce out totally, or you need to make provisions to try to enforce it legally. But as it stands now, so that chapter is kind of like a tricky chapter because it's neither.
I love that, though. I like how you're really making people think, because in asking the question, I know my listeners, somebody's yelling out, it's a covenant, I know it's a covenant, and someone's going, no, it's a contract. And then ultimately you're like, let's really and truly think about what it is. I love that. Such an intriguing question. Now, in the book, would you say that you wrote the book from a pro-marriage perspective, or is it just information, and this is just being in the legal profession, this is just fact, and you're letting people kind of decipher or make a decision for themselves?
Well, it's definitely not pro-marriage. It's probably more anti-divorce. But then it's also very much filled with information. Some people have said it reads more like kind of like a treatise. It gives you a lot of information and background information about marriage and divorce. But it's more of an anti-divorce book because I believe that divorce it's causing more damage to society than most people would either care to admit or realize.
It really is. It really, truly is. It's affecting our children. It's affecting, our mental stability many times, and people don't like to talk about that. But it really and truly is. Now, I know that people ask questions different ways, so I'm just going to kind of throw this one out there. Should everyone get married? Is marriage for everyone? Considering the type of work that you do, and you see it from both sides, should everyone get married?
The short answer is no. Marriage is not for everyone. When you, especially biblically, coming from someone who professes to want to follow God, his requirements, marriage is not for everyone, because marriage requires a lot of. It causes you to make a lot of sacrifices. It causes you to do things that you may not feel like wanting to do. And unless you possess a certain maturity level, you shouldn't get married.
Right. That's really true. The various stages of our life, becoming a parent or getting married, it could be a very selfless thing. The action that you're taking, as opposed to, it's all about me, and it's like, no, more like team us, so right. I can understand that. Well, is there ever a time when a couple should actually get divorced? Like, are there, as a therapist, we talk about red flags when we do premarital counseling and all of that, but is there ever a time when a couple should just most definitely seek a divorce?
Only, and that's a tricky question because if a divorce is going to be had, I believe that it should be in the same manner in which the two people became married. The two people decided that they both wanted to become married, so they sat down and one person brought up the subject, the other person accepted, and then they got married. I think if a divorce has to be had, it has to be a situation to where both parties equally think that that's the best thing to happen and needs to happen. Outside of that, it's very hard, based on what I've read and researched, to conclude that a divorce should happen at any other point.
Do you think that, and this is just a little side question, and just your opinion, do you think that that's why, I know there are a few states that still do not have a no-fault divorce, that there has to be grounds, there has to be a reason for seeking the divorce. Do you think that that's why many states have held on to that more traditional view, if you will, of why you're seeking a divorce?
Well, at one point historically, all the states had, in this country, they had the at-faults, to where, you got married, and if you wanted a divorce, you had to show that that other party was doing something that was detrimental either to your health, your children's health, or something. But bit by bit, as the population increased, as society changed, as society became more lax, so to speak, states started saying, look, whatever, you don't need to show any default. And so people started to exercise that option much more. And I think now there's a small handful of states that say, you have to show some sort of fault, some sort of reason why you're divorcing. But I think that it's just a matter of time to where across the United States there's going to be all no fault. And I think it's because it's easy, and I think it's because so many people, they don't want to feel trapped. They don't want to feel like they have to prove something. They just want to they have that freedom to be able to say, look, I don't want to be in this anymore. I shouldn't have to say why. I think it's a result of where society is going as a nation.
That is very true. And that's a discussion for another time. But that is, I would love to hear this perspective from a legal point of view. Being a woman and just seeing how women's rights and the things that we have been allowed to do have changed over time. It's just a very interesting perspective to talk about. Thank you so much for answering that question for me. It is almost time for us to go to break, but I want to make sure that everyone is able to visit you on the internet. So, Solon, what are the best ways for people to get to you or to follow you?
The book is on Facebook. It's Colored Water. You could just do a search for Colored Water on Facebook. I have a website. It's called asksolon.com. That's AskSolon.com. And then there's an email. People could shoot me an email at asksolon@gmail.com.
Well, listeners, there you go. We need to take a very short break, but when we get back, we will continue to speak with Solon Phillips. We'll be back right after this. And we are back. Thank you so much for joining me for Daily Spark with Dr. Angela. I'm your host, Dr. Angela Chester. Today, my guest is Solon Phillips, and you can find him online at asksolon.com. That's AskSolon.com. We are talking about his book, Colored Water, Marriage, Involuntary Divorce, and Law and God. That's right, Colored Water. And I love how it kind of alludes to how murky it could be when we're talking about relationships, when we're talking about marriage and this funky word called divorce as well. So, Solon, you have a chapter in your book that's kind of directed towards the government. Do you think that government should play a role in family matters, or they should kind of leave family matters alone? What's your stance on that? What do you believe they should do?
Well, I believe there's a chapter it's called "Should the Government Play a Role?" And I do believe that the government has a responsibility or an obligation to do something more to strengthen the family, to protect the kids in the country. President Obama had a powerful quote while he was in his presidency. He said that this is our first task as a society, keeping our children safe. This is how we will be judged, and their voices should compel us to change. We look forward to working with Congress on a bipartisan basis to find real solutions to protecting America's most valuable asset, our children. Knowing that our children are such a valuable asset, if not the most important asset this country has, I feel that the government has an obligation to do things in order to protect marriage, because divorce has the potential of tearing and destroying children. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of things that they can do, I think, that could help do that. One of the things that they can do is mandate that schools teach, maybe as early as high school, teach family and development, so they can know what marriage is about, what divorce is, what happens when couples divorce. I think if kids knew about this at early on, just like they teach biology, mathematics, that mm-hmm. they'll be educated into what marriage is, and they'll make decisions. They'll be more cautious in making their decisions, mm-hmm. so to speak, mm-hmm. before marriage. And I mean, there's a long laundry list of things that the government can do. They have the power to do in order to educate members of this country on marriage and divorce.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That is a really good idea, in my opinion. That is a wonderful idea. I remember of generations before myself, home economics was available. I don't know if they still make that available widespread across the country, but that was something that everyone, and especially women, took because it really helped you prepare for the role of being a wife someday, and it was understood that the guys took shop or metalworks or something like that because it was going to help you in what you're doing, not limit you and say that you were just going to be a housewife, but to be able to prepare you for that next stage. Why not prepare our society for marriage? That is a great suggestion. The next question that I have for you is, and I love the direction that your book takes, and that is about restrictions on marriage. I believe that there are some states that require that before they will allow you to get married, you have to prove that you have gone through premarital counseling. So let's flip the coin. Do you think that government should be able to place restrictions on marriage in any way, shape, or form, or just prior to you getting married?
Well, the restriction. Well, first, marriage is a fundamental right. It's a right that every human has, every mm-hmm. citizen in this country has. But there are already certain restrictions, right? You can't get married if you're 13.
Right.
You can't get married if you're related to the person you want to marry. I can't marry my sister. Right. So there are restrictions now, but I think that the government, again, can do a little bit more to not only before you get married, like really require some sort of training and testing to make sure that the person understands what they're doing. But as far as divorcing, I think that we're moving towards this place where you can just divorce for any reason. And when you look at it, it's very synonymous to Moses' day, when history says that you could divorce your wife if she overcooked the food. I mean, they started getting ridiculous with it. And that's when Moses had to make these laws to say, look, there has to be certain reasons why. You can't just do this for whatever. Mm-hmm. And I think that we're right back in that stage where, I can say something that's politically correct, like we just don't get along, we have irreconcilable differences, but deep down I know that it's just someone else that I want to marry.
Right.
And based on that, I don't have to prove anything. I can just divorce my wife. And I think that a selfish person would take that option, but they're not really realizing what's going to happen to the kids. You know, they say, oh, the kids will be fine, oh, this and the other. But there's no real reason. So I think that the state should go back to having some sort of fault and being able to prove, look, why do you want to end this marriage? You know, are you getting beaten? Is the person in jail? Or there should be some concrete reason opposed to the just no fault divorces.
I can understand your argument on that, even if it's just simply being able to state something like a real reason. I totally agree with that. Now, your book again is packed with just so much information, and I don't want you, and you're doing such a great answer, like, you know, giving just a little, you know, little tidbit, a little taste of what it is without giving too many spoilers. And thank you for that, because I know that we're really talking about that. But I have to ask this question because it talks about pastors and clergymen. And I know that sometimes we kind of try to steer clear from the clergy people when it comes to, you know, how do we look at their families, and are they giving us, showing us by their actions what we should and shouldn't do. But I'm going to ask this question anyway. So you have a chapter that talks about pastors and clergymen. Do you think that what the church is doing or isn't doing, do you think that that's playing a role in our family issues, our family concerns, our family matters? And if you think it's going like towards the negative, what do you think we could do to bring it back to the positive?
Okay, so when I started to write this, I interviewed hundreds of people I was in groups on Facebook. There's these groups that there are people within the groups who have either been abandoned or involuntarily divorced, and they're all Christians. And in interviewing them, I discovered that the majority of them, if not all of them, went to their pastors, and their pastors, most of them, I think it was as high as 92%, received little to no support. They went to them trying to get some sort of answers, but most of the time they was going to them to try to get the pastors to intervene on their behalf. And 9 times out of 10, it was like, well, you know, that's your spouse. I don't know. If they're not talking to you, they're not going to talk to me. It was something. So that led me to do the research, and what came out was, I think that the pastors have a responsibility as spokespeople of God to speak up and call sin by its rightful name. So if a husband and wife is married and it's well known that the husband has a girlfriend, he's not coming home often, and they're members of this church, I think that the pastor has an obligation to go speak to that husband and say, look, what you're doing is not right. This is not what you believe. And to do something for the marriage. And then also the family, that the kids and the wife who maybe now without that husband, and they're hurting, obviously, you know, when your family is falling apart, there's people who are hurting. I think that churches and elders and leaders should gather around this family and do more. Treat them like they treat the family when a member dies within that family. You know, they send food, they bring them up, and they pray over them, they put their hands on them. They do all these things when it's a life that's lost. But then when there's a divorce, they're like, oh, well, you know, everyone's quiet. But in the book, I found out that divorce is much more painful than death. You know, when your spouse who vowed to be with you for life makes the decision to no longer be with you, that pain lingers much longer than when your spouse died and you know that they loved you when they died. Now your spouse is loving someone else and you're aware of that. So the pain is much, not only you have to go through the legal process, which is another headache.
Right.
But just leaving, the pain is much worse than a death. So knowing that, I think that pastors should really pay attention and do things for these spouses.
So, sticking in that vein, do you think that there are, evil influences that affect marriages, or even like a demonic spirit that can come in and intervene in some marriages?
Yeah, that there's actually a chapter that's totally dedicated to demons. I know that sounds crazy, and people always ask me, well, what's that about? But sometimes a spouse would act totally contrary to what you're used to them acting like, right? And when you read the Bible and you see these stories of these demonics, these people who became influenced by demonic forces, Paul in one of his letters say, pray that this person would not be caught up to do the will of Satan. You see the story in Luke where Jesus walks into the synagogue and there's this man sitting there in church. And then he walks in and a demon speaks out of the man and says, what do you have to do with us? Like the man didn't even know the demon was there. But when the demon saw Jesus, the demon was like, well, what do you have to do with us? It's not our time yet. And Jesus cast him out. So that made me think, what? Demons are not all dead now. In 2017, we can rightfully assume that there are demons patrolling this planet, and they're doing exactly what they were doing back in Jesus' time. So it made me do a big research into demonology, and there's a belief that there are certain marriage-breaking demons, that all they do is make attempts to break up marriages. And if people are open to demonic influence, they may start doing things that they wouldn't normally have done had it not been for the demons that was influencing them. So I do believe that certain marriages are very much influenced by demonic powers.
Now, there may be someone listening who is unfamiliar with the term that you have opened yourself up, or you have allowed for this demonic influence to come over your life. What do you mean by that, for someone who's never heard that term before?
Well, there's certain things that's believed that you can do that would open yourself up to demonic influences. One is heavy drug abuse. When you put yourself in the position that you're not really able to make your decisions, like if you're under the influence of certain drugs, that is a way that you can open yourself up. And there's a list of things that I mentioned in the book that you can do that would open yourself up, that you would need prayer, and you would need someone outside of you to say, look, help this person. This is not my spouse. This is something else that's going on.
Right, most definitely. I'm so glad that you do touch on that as well. Well, we need to go to break. Solon, before we do, though, how can people get in contact with you?
On Facebook, The Colored Water, name of the book, is on Facebook. The website is www.asksolon.com. That's AskSolon.com. And the email is asksolon@gmail.com.
Well, listeners, we need to take a short break. We'll be back right after this. And we are back. Thank you so much for joining me for Daily Spark with Dr. Angela. I'm your host, Dr. Angela Chester. My guest today is Solon Phillips, and he is out of the Bowie, Maryland area, and we are talking about his book, Colored Water. So we're talking marriage, involuntary divorce, the law, and God. So, Solon, how long did it take you to write your book? Is this something that's been a labor of love for a really long time, or did you kind of just sit down, get at it, and make it happen?
Oh no, it took about 2 years.
Okay.
There was a lot of research that went into it.
I can understand that there, and I have to ask that question of every author, because it's so funny how some people say, "Oh no, it took me 5 years," or I've been writing it all of my life, or some people say, it took maybe a couple of months because I have been thinking about it, but I finally put pen to paper and it just came out. So I can understand you did have a lot of research to do. In that research, did you find there to be that God had a very definitive position on marriage and on divorce?
Yes, and marriage and divorce is always a touchy subject, especially to Christians, because I think that Christians have their own idea and interpretation of what God wants for their lives, and sometimes it may differ from what is actually in Scripture. So it was a tough chapter to write, but towards the end of the chapter, I use scriptures that clearly indicate that, one, God hates divorce. I mean, he says that in Malachi. And I think his intent is for husbands and wives to be able to stay in their marriage forever. God is a God of reconciliation, and he talks a lot about that. The Bible talks a lot about reconciliation. So when a husband and wife have a fallout, no problem is too big if you really have God in the middle of it. And I learned that one pastor wrote that God gave marriage to man in order for man to perfect his character and be more like God. Because all of the characteristics that's needed in marriage is the characteristics of God. Long-suffering, patient, forever forgiving, unconditional love, all of these things. So I think God, this institution that he's created, was created with a purpose. And that purpose is to make us more like him. So, yeah, that chapter is a tough chapter, and I see some people may not want to accept it or believe it, but it's there.
And I can understand that, because there are some passages or even some chapters in the Bible that people have a hard time, really grasping and taking to heart. So I can understand that. And like you said, it's a touchy subject, and it can be really hard for folks. Well, is there anything that a couple can do, or that an individual can do, to help avoid this involuntary divorce that you speak on? Are there any tips or things or is there a perspective that people need to take on and say, this is what I can do so that we don't end up at that position anyway?
Yes, the last chapter, Preventive Methods, it talks about the things that single people can do in order to mitigate their damages, so to speak, in order to reduce the possibility of their spouse ever jumping ship. And there's things that you can look out for, and these are factual things that the research uncovered. And it's just things to look out for, and none of this is a hard rule to say, well, if he doesn't have this, if she doesn't have that, that means that she's going to divorce me. No, it's just statistically wise. The older you wait, well, not the older, marrying at least the age of 26 is a safer bet than marrying under 26. And the reason being is the human mind has not fully developed until 25. The human mind cannot appreciate long-term planning and things that's needed for marriage. So if you marry under the age of 26, you may not be able to fully understand what you're doing. So they say it's better to wait till you're after 26. Another thing is to look for people who have a level of morality, not necessarily religious people, because some religious people can be some of the most horrid individuals walking the face of the earth, but people who just do nice things without expecting anything in return just because it's the right thing to do. People who have a level of commitment. They say that the more educated a person is, the less likely they are to abandon the marriage. And the reason being, it takes commitment and planning and everything to earn a degree. So the numbers are staggering when you look at an educated person compared to a non-educated. Now, this doesn't mean that an educated person won't divorce you. It just means that the chances are less than that they will.
I love it. I really, really love it, and that gives you just something to think about. If you want to know the rest of the answers, listeners, you're going to have to get a copy of the book and read it for yourself, because I know folks are like, yes, give me more. I got to pick up a copy of the book for that. So, Solon, my next question for you is, should Christians go to marriage counselors? Now, some people say absolutely positively yes, premarital counseling should be a prerequisite for anyone who wants to get married, regardless if they're Christian or in the secular world. And then some people say, well, you should go to a counselor, but it doesn't have to be a Christian counselor, even if you are a Christian, so on and so forth. What is your stance about Christians and marriage counselors?
So I think that everyone should definitely go to premarital counseling. But this chapter deals mainly, it's a chapter on marriage counselors. It deals mainly with once you're married and the marriage starts to have difficulties. They can be very helpful, but there's certain things that you should look for or keep an eye out for when you're going to a marriage counselor. And that you have to be aware that the marriage counselor is going to walk into a room with you with their own preconceived notions about marriage, their own biases. And you should try as much as possible not to go just with yourself and take advice based on that one-on-one session. So if I'm married and I go to a marriage counselor and I'm telling them all about the horrible things that my wife is doing, and they listen to me and say, well, yeah, you should divorce, that is as fair as you just going to a judge and trying to seek a judgment based on your own testimony. The only way a therapist should be able to give you advice on your marriage is if she's heard from both sides, right? Because the person who's telling the information, they may be lying, they may be exaggerating, you don't know what, and so they're giving you information based on one story that's just not the right thing to do. And they shouldn't give you advice about what to do in your marriage. They should be giving you advice what to do, how to deal with whatever's going on. But it shouldn't impact the other spouse and the children. So I caution people to be very aware and informed before deciding to go. I think that marriage counseling can be good if it's done together. But when one person wants to see you alone, and then I throw in a little bit about the demonic influences, and I said that if Satan could use a serpent, and all throughout scriptures, there was certain times where a demonic influence spoke. You never know if the counselor you're going to is being influenced by a demonic force. And they're telling you stuff that's going to actually destroy you and your marriage. So you got to be very careful.
That is great advice. And I'm telling you, listeners, as a therapist, that is something that a really great therapist is going to make that distinction and explain to you that the reason why it's called couples counseling is because you're supposed to come as a couple. Individual counseling is as an individual. And it really and truly is important because there are the two sides of what actually happened, and you do need to work on it as a couple. If you can't get couples counseling, definitely do an individual something, but couples counseling really, really, really is important if you're working on your marriage. The next question that I have for you is that I love that side question statement that you just made. It's like you never know who that counselor is, so be careful there. We're talking spousal abandonment. That might be something that some people are not familiar with. They may have even never heard the term. But that's something that you talk about. What is spousal abandonment?
So spousal abandonment, it's a legal term, but it basically just means that one spouse leaves all of their obligations and responsibilities, and they either physically remove themselves from the home or they mentally, emotionally remove themselves, and one spouse is left with everything.
So would you say that the spouse is kind of just walking around on autopilot, like they're as though the other person doesn't exist or isn't even there?
Yeah, pretty much. And usually when that happens, it's a foreshadowing of the physical part being removed shortly thereafter.
Wow, yeah, that's got to be a really hard place, to be. You talk in the book about something called ASEF. What does that mean?
ASEF stands for Abandoned Spouse Emergency Fund. When I was in these groups, I learned that after an abandonment, spouses were left alone, right? At one point they had two incomes, and now they wake up and they found they just had one income. And so bills, they had to pick and choose which bills could be paid, and certain bills were left unpaid. So we developed a fund that went towards spouses whose lights were turned off or whose water was turned off. And we would save money up, and we would actually contact the electric company and pay their bill. It's something that I'm still working on. I'm trying to get bigger because abandonment happens all across the country, all across the world, and there's no insurance for that. You don't, like with the life insurance, if someone dies, you can get insurance, but if someone decides they don't want to be a part of your family anymore, there's nothing that you can do. You can hire an attorney and try to get money, but you're spending money in the hopes of getting money, and it's money that you don't have. So a lot of times there are a lot of spouses who are left with nothing. They have to deal with their spouse being gone, but they also have to deal with, hey, how am I going to pay this water bill? And so the ASEF is a fund that it's still a work in progress, but I'm trying to have something for those spouses who are abandoned and they're having difficulty paying the essential bills.
What a great idea! That is just really, really awesome. And I'm sure the people that need to utilize the funding are also grateful that you've thought that far ahead and you're trying to be proactive about it and not just reactionary. Well, my last question for you is, what advice or a quick little nugget could you give to a single person about marriage or divorce?
Marriage, look well into it. Solomon says that a wise man looketh well into his ways. Look at the person that you're marrying. Treat it as though it's the most important decision you'll ever make. It's the only decision that will have generational consequences. You have children with them, that's going to go on and on and on. So treat the decision to marry as the most important decision you will ever make. And if you're struggling in a marriage, I would encourage both spouses to do all that they can to be true to their vows. Most people vow to be married until death. So if you've made that vow, do all that you can do to stick to it. And if you are divorced, there's healing. There's a lot of books out there. I write that it's a wound that never fully heals, but there's a lot of help out there, and I suggest that you read, go to people, and if you're a praying person, that's probably the best way to deal with it.
Well, Solon, thank you so much for spending time on the show with me here today, and for the last time, just in case somebody came in a little bit late to the show. Can you tell them how can people get in contact with you?
Yes, the website is www.asksolon.com. Just get on Facebook and search Colored Water, and the email is asksolon@gmail.com.
There you are, everyone. Pick up a copy of this book. What a wonderful resource to have, no matter which side of the road that you are on. Thank you again, Solon, for being on the show with me today.
Thank you. Thank you.
And as always, listeners, may you continue to have an awesome, awesome week. May you find God's grace and mercy in all that you do. Until next time, have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.